Every financial collapse in history was declared a surprise. The economists didn't see it coming. The central bankers called it contained. The politicians promised stability days before everything broke. They were lying, or they were blind. Because when you actually study the forensics, 800 years of crashes, defaults, currency deaths, and systemic implosions, the same three warning signs appear every single time. Not similar signs. The same signs, identical fingerprints on completely different crimes, centuries apart. Here's what should terrify you. All three of those warning signs are visible right now. Sign 1, everyone believes this time is different. Let's start with the most dangerous sentence in the history of finance. This time is different. Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff spent a decade studying 800 years of financial crises across 66 countries. Their conclusion was brutal. Every single collapse in recorded history was preceded by an era when investors, governments, and ordinary people became convinced that the old rules no longer applied, that they had discovered something new, that the past was irrelevant. They called this phenomenon the "this time is different" syndrome, and they weren't being poetic. They meant it as a clinical diagnosis, a collective cognitive failure so predictable it functions like a law of physics. Look at what happened in the Netherlands in 1637. Tulip bulbs, flowers, were trading at prices equivalent to 10 times the annual salary of a skilled craftsman. One rare Semper Augustus bulb sold for the price of a canal house in Amsterdam. When historians look back at this, the universal reaction is disbelief. How did otherwise intelligent people convince themselves that a flower bulb was worth a house? The answer is exactly what Reinhart and Rogoff documented 3 centuries later. The Dutch convinced themselves that the traditional rules of value no longer applied. Tulip bulbs weren't just flowers. They were luxury status symbols in a newly prosperous republic. New wealth from global trade meant new buyers. The market was different now. It wasn't. But here's the thing that gets buried in every retelling of the Tulip Mania. The people who got destroyed weren't fools. Many of them were sophisticated merchants who had built real businesses. They weren't stupid. They were infected. Infected by the most dangerous belief system in economic history. The same virus appeared in Vienna in 1873. Austria-Hungary was in the middle of an extraordinary economic expansion. Industrialization, railways, urban construction. The empire was modernizing at speed. A speculative bubble formed in railway and real estate stocks. When a journalist asked a prominent Viennese banker in early 1873 whether he was concerned about the overvaluation, the banker allegedly replied, "The industrial age has permanently altered the mathematics of growth. Past patterns no longer apply." The Vienna Stock Exchange crashed on May 9, 1873, Black Friday. The panic spread to Germany, then to the United States, triggering the Long Depression, a global contraction that lasted nearly 2 decades. Same sentence, same crash, 2 different centuries. Now examine what the IMF was saying about Iceland in 2007. Their official assessment, published 12 months before Iceland's banking system imploded in one of the most spectacular collapses in financial history, concluded that the Icelandic banks were well capitalized and that the country's strong economic fundamentals would support continued growth. Iceland had a population of 300,000 people. Its 3 major banks had accumulated foreign liabilities of over 50 billion euros, more than 6 times the entire Icelandic GDP. When analysts pointed this out, the Icelandic government and banking establishment responded with the same elegant refrain. Iceland was different. A sophisticated, modern Nordic economy. Old rules didn't apply. Within 18 months, the Icelandic krona had collapsed by 50%, the banks were nationalized, and the country required an emergency IMF bailout. The BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, which functions as the central bank of central banks, has documented this pattern with near clinical precision. In their annual reports from 2004 through 2007, they issued increasingly urgent warnings about credit expansion, asset price inflation, and systemic fragility. They were largely ignored, because everyone knew this time was different. There's a reason this delusion is so persistent. It isn't stupidity, it's incentive structure. During a bubble, the people who say, "this time is different," are getting rich. The people who say, "this looks like 1873," look like they don't understand the new paradigm. Careers are built on optimism. Pessimists don't get promoted. When being right means being poor, most people choose to be wrong together, which is precisely what makes this warning sign so difficult to act on. The moment everyone stops saying this time is different, the crash has already started. Sign 2. Debt reaches the Minsky threshold. Hyman Minsky was an American economist who spent most of his career being ignored. He worked out of the University of Washington and later the Levy Economics Institute, building what he called the financial instability hypothesis. The mainstream economics establishment largely dismissed it. Too heterodox, too pessimistic, too inconvenient. Then 2008 happened, and suddenly everyone was talking about the Minsky Moment. Minsky's core insight was deceptively simple. Stability is destabilizing. When economies are calm and credit is flowing smoothly, rational actors gradually take on more risk, not recklessly, rationally. If you've made 5 successful leveraged investments in a row, taking on more leverage seems logical. If defaults have been minimal for a decade, lending standards that seemed prudent 10 years ago now seem paranoid. Minsky identified 3 stages of debt accumulation that appear in every credit cycle. The first stage, he called hedge finance. Borrowers can service both their debt principal and their interest payments from current income. The loan is fully self-sustaining. A factory owner borrows to buy equipment. The equipment generates revenue. The revenue covers the loan. Clean, sustainable. The second stage is speculative finance. The borrower can cover the interest, but not the principal. They depend on being able to roll over, refinance, extend. The loan is no longer self-liquidating. It depends on the continued availability of credit. A real estate developer who covers monthly interest payments but expects to repay the principal only by selling the property at a higher price. Functional during expansion, fragile during contraction. The third stage Minsky called Ponzi finance. The borrower cannot even cover the interest from current income. They're borrowing more just to service existing debt. The entire structure requires asset prices to keep rising and credit to keep flowing. The moment either condition fails, the entire edifice collapses. Now here's the part that most explanations leave out. The transition from stage 1 to stage 3 doesn't happen because people become stupid. It happens because stability itself creates the conditions for instability. When credit is cheap and defaults are rare, Ponzi financing looks like sophisticated leverage. It only looks insane in retrospect. Study the French financial crisis of 1720. John Law, a Scottish financier operating in France, constructed what may be the most audacious monetary experiment in history. He created France's first central bank, issued paper currency backed by shares in the Mississippi Company, which held a monopoly on French trade with Louisiana. The share price of the Mississippi Company rose 2,000% in 2 years. French nobles, merchants, servants, everyone was buying shares. Credit was freely extended. More shares were issued to meet demand. More paper money was printed to buy more shares. Every loan was backed by shares. The shares derived their value from the loans. The entire structure was circular. Pure Ponzi finance at a national scale, executed with elegance and institutional legitimacy. When the share price began falling in early 1720, the structure unwound catastrophically. Law fled France with practically nothing. The resulting financial trauma was so severe, it poisoned French attitudes toward banking and paper currency for a century. Historians have argued that France's reluctance to embrace modern banking and industrial finance, which contributed to Britain's industrial dominance, traces directly back to the psychological scar left by 1720. The same pattern appears in the Japanese asset bubble of the 1980s. Japanese banks, operating under the implicit guarantee of government support, extended credit against real estate collateral. As property values rose, the collateral was worth more, which justified extending more credit, which drove property values higher. At the peak of the bubble in 1989, the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. Corporate Japan was in pure Ponzi territory, rolling over debt against assets that derived their value entirely from continued credit availability. The Nikkei stock index peaked on December 29, 1989. What followed was a 30-year economic stagnation, not a recession, not even a depression. A slow, grinding deflation as the debt accumulated during the Ponzi phase had to be worked off. Japan's lost decade became 2 lost decades, then 3. The BIS has been tracking global debt ratios for decades. Their analysis shows something specific about the relationship between the rate of credit growth and subsequent crisis probability. The metric they watch most closely isn't the total debt level. It's the change in the ratio of private credit to GDP over short time periods. A rapid expansion of 10 percentage points over 3 years has historically preceded a banking crisis with striking consistency across different economies and time periods. The Fred database at the St. Louis Federal Reserve documents this for anyone willing to look. Study the credit expansion curves preceding 1929, 1989 in Japan, 1997 in Southeast Asia, 2007 in the United States. The shapes are nearly identical. Rapid credit acceleration, followed by a brief plateau, followed by collapse. And what happens at the Minsky threshold, the precise moment when Ponzi financing becomes the dominant mode in an economy? A small shock is sufficient. It doesn't need to be large. The trigger for the 1997 Asian crisis was a speculative attack on the Thai baht, a currency with a $30 billion economy. It triggered a cascade that wiped out trillions in wealth across the entire region, brought Indonesia to the edge of state collapse, and forced South Korea, an industrial powerhouse, into an IMF emergency bailout. Small trigger, enormous destruction, because the underlying debt structure was already Minsky fragile. Here's the question that should keep any serious observer awake. If the BIS warning threshold for credit expansion is a 10 percentage point increase in private credit to GDP over 3 years, what do you call a world where total global debt, government, corporate, household, reached $315 trillion by 2024, approaching 3 times global GDP, having roughly tripled over the past 2 decades? Minsky would have a word for it. Sign 3, the yield curve. Tells the truth before anyone else does. There's a tool buried in the bond market that has predicted every significant recession in the United States over the past 50 years without a single false positive that led to a catastrophic outcome. It doesn't have a dramatic name. It doesn't require sophisticated modeling. It's called the yield curve inversion. In normal conditions, borrowing money for longer periods costs more. If you want to borrow for 10 years instead of 2, you pay a higher interest rate. This makes intuitive sense. Longer time horizon means more uncertainty, more risk, higher compensation demanded. But periodically, this relationship inverts. Short-term interest rates rise above long-term rates. The 2-year Treasury yield climbs above the 10-year yield. When bond traders, the most informed and well-capitalized participants in any financial market, are willing to accept less return for lending money for a decade than for 2 years, they are expressing a specific belief that the near-term environment will be worse than the long-term, that rates will fall in the future because growth will weaken or collapse, that the economy is about to deteriorate significantly. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York maintains a model based entirely on the yield curve spread. The historical track record is extraordinary. The curve inverted in December 1988. The recession began in July 1990. The curve inverted in June 1998 and again more sharply in 2000. The dot-com recession began in March 2001. The curve inverted in August 2006. The global financial crisis began in December 2007. The curve inverted in March 2022, reaching its most extreme inversion in 40 years by 2023. Each time, the mainstream response was identical to the pattern Reinhart and Rogoff documented. Economists published papers explaining why this time the inversion was a technical anomaly, why the traditional signal was compromised by quantitative easing, or by foreign demand for treasuries, or by structural changes in the bond market, why the old rules didn't apply. But why does this signal work so reliably? Because the yield curve isn't a prediction. It's a real-time aggregation of information from the most liquid market in the world, incorporating the expectations of every institution managing sovereign debt globally. It doesn't predict the future. It reads the present, and what it reads is the actual behavior of money. Now, examine this through a historical lens that predates modern bond markets. When Philip II of Spain began repeatedly defaulting on sovereign debt in the 16th century, 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596, the Genoese bankers who financed the Spanish crown responded in precisely the way that modern bond markets respond to yield curve signals. They demanded higher compensation for shorter-term loans. They shortened the duration of their exposure. They required collateral. The spread between what Spain paid for immediate credit versus long-term financing widened dramatically with each default episode. The Genoese banking houses were reading the same signal that the modern yield curve encodes. The short-term environment is more dangerous than the long-term. The borrower is under acute stress. The risk of near-term failure is elevated. The Spanish crown, convinced of its own indispensability, the greatest empire in the world, possessor of all the silver in the Americas, dismissed these signals as the anxiety of cautious bankers who didn't understand Spain's unique position. Philip II famously told his finance ministers that God would not allow Spain to fail, as his was a holy mission. Spain defaulted again in 1607. The Genoese banking network collapsed. The center of European financial power shifted permanently to Amsterdam. The yield curve doesn't lie. It cannot lie. It is the aggregated real money behavior of the world's most sophisticated capital allocators. When they collectively decide that near-term risk exceeds long-term risk, they express that belief with actual capital, not predictions, not models. Actual money. Study the credit spread data from the BIS before the 1997 Asian crisis. Thai corporate borrowers were paying 300 basis points above U.S. Treasuries in early 1996. By mid-1997, that spread had widened to over 700 basis points. The bond market knew. It was screaming. The governments of Southeast Asia held emergency press conferences reassuring investors that their currency pegs were secure. The IMF published optimistic assessments of regional growth prospects. The credit spreads told a different story. They told the truth. The fundamental reason this signal works, and has worked across entirely different economic systems, time periods, and financial architectures, is that credit is the circulatory system of a modern economy. When credit becomes expensive at short durations while remaining cheap at long durations, blood is clotting near the heart. The organism is under acute stress. The outward signs may not yet be visible. The patient may still be walking and talking, but the vitals are failing. Minsky understood this. His financial instability hypothesis is essentially a theory of how healthy credit circulation degrades progressively into dysfunction. The yield curve is the ECG that reads that degradation in real time, which brings us to the convergence. Here is what makes 800 years of financial history genuinely terrifying. These three signs, the "this time is different" delusion, the Minsky debt threshold, and yield curve inversion, don't merely appear independently before crises. They appear together, they reinforce each other, they form a system. The "this time is different" delusion is what allows the debt to accumulate past the Minsky threshold in the first place. If people recognized the pattern, they would stop. But the psychological mechanism of the bubble systematically suppresses pattern recognition in precisely the people who most need it. The debt accumulation then corrupts the institutions that should be issuing warnings. Central banks that should be raising rates to cool credit expansion instead accommodate it, because raising rates would expose the fragility of the Ponzi structures that have already formed. The BIS has documented this repeatedly. The tendency of central banks to be systematically more accommodating during credit expansions than their own stated frameworks would suggest. And as the debt reaches Minsky fragile levels, the yield curve begins to reflect it. Long-term bond buyers see what's coming. They compress their duration. They extend to shorter maturities. The curve inverts, at which point the "this time is different" reflex reaches maximum intensity, because an inverted yield curve is uncomfortable. It implies that the expansion is unsustainable. It implies that recessions are structural rather than accidental. It implies that the prosperity of the past decade was partly borrowed from the suffering of the next one. These are ideas that powerful institutions have enormous incentives to suppress. So they do. And the delay between the inversion and the crash, which has averaged roughly 18 months historically, becomes the window during which the maximum number of people are drawn into the Ponzi structures. The last buyers in a bubble are always the ones who arrive when the signal is loudest and the refutation most emphatic. The Roman debasement didn't happen because Caracalla was uniquely corrupt. It happened because the institutional logic of the empire, legions demanding pay, borders requiring defense, an emperor requiring legitimacy, created a system that could not acknowledge the warning signs without threatening the entire structure. The people who understood what the coin debasement meant were mostly either silent or dead. The Bank for International Settlements, in their 2023 annual report, noted something that received almost no mainstream coverage. Global debt levels, combined with current interest rate environments, had created a fragility profile comparable to, or exceeding, the years immediately preceding the 2008 crisis. They specifically noted the compressed spreads in corporate credit markets relative to fundamental creditworthiness. They flagged the divergence between asset valuations and underlying economic growth rates. They were measuring the convergence. All three signs present simultaneously. History doesn't send polite warnings. It doesn't knock twice. You came here knowing something was wrong. Not with the official numbers, not with the press releases from the Treasury. Something deeper. The feeling that the explanation you're being given doesn't quite fit the reality you're living. You were right. Because the warning signs of collapse have never been secret. They've been documented, studied, and published by the most credible economic institutions in the world. The BIS flags them. The academic literature is exhaustive. Reinhart and Rogoff put 800 years of evidence in a single book. The problem has never been lack of information. It's been the systematic incentive to ignore what that information means. Every civilization that collapsed under the weight of debt, currency debasement, and credit expansion had access to historical precedent. Rome knew what happened to Greece. Germany knew what happened to Rome. The lesson was always available. It was never acted on, because acting on it requires accepting that the prosperity you're currently experiencing is partly borrowed, that the stability is manufactured, that the people telling you everything is fine have very specific reasons to tell you that. History's three warning signs have never pointed to a specific crash date. They've never provided a precise timeline. What they've provided, unfailingly, across 8 centuries, is a description of the conditions under which crashes become inevitable. Understanding the conditions doesn't tell you when the storm will arrive, but it tells you whether you're already standing in the path of it. Subscribe, because the patterns are accelerating, and the next lesson from history is closer than most people are willing to admit.